I surprised my CEO husband at his own office with his favorite lunch, but the security guard laughed and said she sees his real wife walk out. Every single day I stood at the gate with a paper bag of Italian takeout warm against my chest and waited for the guard to wave me through. He didn't. He looked at the visitor badge I'd printed at home, then back at me, and laughed. Not a mean laugh, a confused one. "Ma'am, I see his wife every day," he said. "There she is right now." He pointed past my shoulder. A woman in a sharp gray suit was crossing the lobby, heels clicking on marble, moving like she'd built the place herself. Sienna Vale. I knew the name from the org chart Weston kept taped inside his home office closet. Vice President of Operations, 34 years old, hired 4 years ago out of a defense contractor in Seattle. My name is Elena Marsh. I have been married to Weston Marsh for 28 years. And standing at the gate of the company, I helped him build with my father's money and my own 2 hands. A stranger in a security booth told me my husband had a different wife, one who walked out those doors every single day at lunch. "Wrong building," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I must have the address mixed up. I set the takeout bag on the counter of the security desk. Chicken piccata, the kind he liked from the place on Larimer Street, the sauce already going lukewarm through the foil. "Could you give this to Weston? Tell him a friend dropped it off." The guard frowned like he wanted to ask something else, but I was already walking. I made it to the parking garage before my hands started shaking. I made it to my car before my legs stopped working right. I sat behind the wheel for 10 full minutes, engine off, watching my knuckles go white on the wheel, before I trusted myself to drive. 28 years. I had never once questioned him. I had packed his lunches and remembered his mother's birthday and signed 1,000 papers. He slid across the kitchen table without reading a word of them, because trust was supposed to be the whole point of a marriage like ours. Apparently, he'd built an entire second life while I stood in our kitchen folding his undershirts into perfect thirds. I didn't cry in that parking garage. I want to be clear about that because for a long time afterward, people assumed I fell apart on the spot. I didn't. I sat very still, and somewhere in those 10 minutes, I made a decision that would end up costing my husband a great deal more than a marriage. I need to back up, though, because none of this makes sense without the 28 years underneath it. I met Weston Marsh in the fall of 1996 at Colorado State. In a business statistics class, we both nearly failed. He was loud and a little arrogant and completely certain he was going to build something enormous someday. I was quieter, more careful, the kind of student who checked her work twice. We were an odd match on paper. We got engaged 18 months later on the observation deck of the student union, and we married on June 14th, 1998, in a backyard in Fort Collins with 110 guests and a cake my mother baked herself because we couldn't afford a bakery one. Weston had an idea before we'd even finished the wedding cake. Precision machined components for aerospace subcontractors, a niche nobody in Colorado was serving well. He needed $40,000 to lease a warehouse and buy his first CNC machine. My father, Harold Cross, a machinist himself for 31 years at a plant in Loveland, believed in him enough to hand over almost his entire retirement savings on a handshake and a promissory note Weston wrote out at our kitchen table. I still have that note. I found it 3 years ago in a fireproof box in Weston's handwriting, promising to repay my father in full within 5 years at 4% interest. He did repay it, eventually in full, with interest. That part of the story, at least, was never a lie. For the first 6 years of Ridgeline Dynamics, I was the company. Not on paper. Weston held the title. Weston signed the loans. Weston's name went on the door. But I did the books at our kitchen table every night after Daniel was born in 1999, and again after Paige came along in 2002. I invoiced clients. I chased down late payments. I filed the quarterly taxes by hand before we could afford an accountant. I held the unpaid ceremonial title of corporate secretary, a title Weston insisted I keep even after the company grew large enough to hire real staff because he told people at every dinner party for a decade, Elena built the foundation this whole thing stands on. I believed him. I think back then it was even true. Ridgeline grew slowly, then all at once. By 2010, we had 40 employees and a real building in Aurora. By 2018, we had contracts with 3 of the 5 major aerospace primes and a headquarters on Spear Boulevard downtown, glass and steel, Weston's name on a brass plaque in the lobby. By last year, Ridgeline Dynamics was valued at just over $200 million, and Weston Marsh was a name people in Denver's business circles said with a certain kind of reverence. I stepped back from day-to-day operations around 2015, once Paige was in high school, and the company had grown past the point where a wife with a home office calculator was useful to it. I stayed on the foundation board Weston set up for corporate giving. I hosted the holiday parties. I sat at his right hand at investor dinners and asked the right follow-up questions, because I'd learned over 2 decades exactly how to make Weston Marsh sound as impressive as he believed himself to be. I thought that was partnership. For a long time it was. Sienna Vale joined Ridgeline 4 years ago, poached from a defense contractor in Seattle with a reputation for turning around underperforming supply chains. Weston came home the week he hired her, practically glowing. "She's sharp, Elena. Sharpest hire I've made in a decade." I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a good thing. The company needed sharp people. I had no reason then to think of her as anything but an asset on an org chart. I want to say clearly, because it matters to the rest of this story, that for most of those 28 years, none of it felt like performance. I remember the night Ridgeline landed its first prime contract back in 2007, a deal deal worth just under $2 million that felt at the time like winning a lottery we'd bought tickets for with everything we owned. Weston came home so wound up he couldn't sit still, and we ended up dancing in the kitchen at midnight to a country station on the radio, Daniel asleep upstairs, Paige not yet born, both of us laughing at nothing in particular because we'd worked so hard for so long that relief felt indistinguishable from joy. I remember him showing up at Daniel's 4th grade science fair in a suit still creased from a flight home from Seattle because he'd promised, and he never missed a promise back then. Not once, not for years. I remember him crying, actually crying, the day my father died, standing at the graveside holding my hand so tightly it left a mark, telling me afterward that Harold Cross was the only man who'd ever believed in him before he'd given anyone a real reason to. I believed that grief was real. I still believe it was real, even now, even knowing everything I know about what came after. People are not simple enough to be only one thing. Weston was, for a very long time, a genuinely good husband and a genuinely grateful son-in-law, and he became, gradually, something else entirely, and I have never fully worked out where exactly the one man ended and the other one began. There was a moment 3 years ago that I didn't think about again until everything else came apart and forced me to look back at it differently. It was the company holiday party, held that year at the Brown Palace downtown. Weston and Sienna slipped out together around 9 o'clock to grab a client's gift from the car. Something about a bottle of scotch left in his trunk for a supplier flying in the next morning. They were gone almost 40 minutes. When Weston came back alone, cheeks flushed from the cold, he told me the valet had misplaced his car and he'd had to walk 2 blocks to find it in the wrong garage. I remember laughing about it with him. I remember thinking he looked a little too pleased with himself for a man who'd just spent 40 minutes freezing in a parking structure. I didn't think about it again for 3 years. By the time I did, it had stopped looking like an inconvenience and started looking like the first small crack in a foundation I'd trusted completely. The unraveling, once I look back on it clearly, took about 3 years to complete, though I only recognized the pattern after it was already finished. It started small enough that I forgave it without a second thought. Our 27th anniversary fell on a Saturday that year, and I'd booked us a table at Lucia's on Blake Street, the same restaurant, though I didn't know it yet, that would show up 14 months running on his calendar with someone else's name attached. Weston canceled that morning. Board emergency, he said. A supplier issue that couldn't wait until Monday. He came home at 11 that night smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, something warm and expensive, and when I mentioned it, gently, not even an accusation, just a question, he looked genuinely wounded. You're imagining things, Elena, he said. I've never given you a reason not to trust me in 28 years. Don't start now over a candle in a conference room. I apologized. I actually apologized for noticing a smell on my own husband's collar, because he said it with such certainty that doubting him felt like the unreasonable thing to do. That was the first time I watched him take something true and hand it back to me as something false, and watched myself believe the version he handed back. About 4 months after that, he asked me to notarize a stack of vendor renewal paperwork for the quarterly board packet. I still held the notary license I'd gotten years earlier for exactly this purpose, back when I handled every piece of paperwork the company generated. Standard stuff, he said, sliding the folder across the table while I was elbow deep in dinner dishes. Legal already signed off. I just need your seal on the renewal page before the board meeting tomorrow. I flipped to the signature page, the way I always had, without reading the 11 pages in front of it, because in 28 years he had never once handed me something that wasn't exactly what he said it was. The vendor's name on that renewal page was Vale Consulting Group, LLC. I noticed it. I remember noticing it, the way you notice a street sign out of the corner of your eye while thinking about something else entirely, and I filed it away as nothing, because Sienna's surname wasn't a rare one, and consulting firms had generic names all the time. I stamped it, I signed it, I went back to the dishes. By early last year, he'd started gently steering me away from the parts of the company I'd always been near. The board's been talking about optics, he told me one night, not quite meeting my eyes. Spouses at quarterly dinners can look a certain way to institutional investors. More professional if it's just leadership in the room. I'd sat at his right hand at those dinners for over a decade. I asked if this was Gerald's idea, or the investors, or his. He said it didn't matter whose idea it was, that he was just trying to protect the company, and wasn't that what mattered? I stopped going. I told myself I didn't mind. I minded when I finally pushed harder around last September. After noticing our checking account running thinner than it should for 2 people whose kids were grown and gone, he flipped the entire conversation before I'd finished my second sentence. Do you have any idea what it takes to run a company this size? He said, voice climbing. I am carrying this entire family, Elena. Daniel's wedding alone cost us $18,000 I never once complained about. I come home exhausted every single night to build something for this family's future, and you're worried about a few $1,000s in the checking account. I remember standing in our kitchen feeling like the unreasonable one, again, for asking where our own money had gone. I let it drop. I always let it drop, because he made not dropping it feel like an act of disloyalty against a man working himself to exhaustion for the people he loved. The last escalation, the one right before the gate, involved his health, or what he told me was his health. He mentioned almost offhand over dinner in early spring that he'd had some tightness in his chest during a board meeting, that his doctor wanted to run tests, that stress was doing a number on him, and he needed things at home to stay calm and simple for a while. I asked which doctor doctor. He named someone I'd never heard of, waved off my offer to come to the appointment, said he didn't want to make a whole thing out of it. When I brought up gently that his sudden distance and the missing money and the canceled anniversary all felt connected somehow, he looked at me with something close to hurt. "I'm trying to protect you and the kids from how bad things have been," he said. "The last thing I need right now is you making this harder. Don't stress me out further," he meant, not while my heart might be failing. I backed off completely. Of course I did. What kind of wife pushes a man she believes might be sick? It was 3 days after that conversation that I decided, on impulse, standing in our kitchen with a container of leftover chicken piccata I'd made too much of the night before, that I would drive it down to his office and surprise him with lunch. 28 years married, and some old stubborn part of me still wanted to take care of him. Still wanted to be the wife who showed up with his favorite meal in a paper bag, even after months of feeling shut quietly out of his own company and his own bank account. I told myself it might remind him of who we used to be, before the board meetings and the chest pains and the distance. I had no idea I was about to learn exactly why he'd wanted me kept away. That's how I ended up standing at the gate of Ridgeline Dynamics with a warm paper bag and a visitor badge, listening to a security guard laugh and point behind me at a woman he called Weston's wife. That night, once his breathing slowed into the pattern I'd memorized after nearly 3 decades of sleeping beside him, I got up and opened his laptop. His password was our wedding date, 6198. He trusted me completely. That, I would come to understand, was his second mistake, and it was a bigger one than the first. His calendar told a story I'd apparently been living without knowing it. Dinners at Lucia's on Blake Street, candlelit, reservations under a name that wasn't his, going back 14 months. A weekend logged at the Cielo Azul Resort in Cabo San Lucas in March, a trip I'd never taken and never heard mentioned. His corporate card showed 2 rooms booked for that same weekend. One quietly canceled the same afternoon it was booked. One name attached to nearly every entry on that calendar for over a year, Sienna Vale. I kept scrolling because I couldn't make myself stop. Our joint savings sat open in another tab, and the number on the screen didn't match the number that should have been there after 28 years of 2 incomes and a paid-off house. We should have had close to $300,000. We had $47,000. Someone had been quietly draining our life for years, a few thousand at a time, small enough that I never noticed, because I never had a reason to look at numbers he'd always handled. I called in sick the next morning for the first time in 6 years. I went through every drawer in his home office while the house sat silent around me. In the back of his closet, tucked inside an old watch box he never opened anymore, the one that used to hold his father's Rolex before he switched to something newer, I found a single silver key. A paper tag hung off it on a thin white string. An address was written on the tag in his own handwriting. A luxury building on Spear Boulevard. I had driven past 100 times without once wondering what was inside it. I drove there with my hands shaking on the wheel again, except this time I didn't stop in the driveway to compose myself first. In the underground garage, space 214, sat a black Mercedes I recognized instantly from the senior leadership row in the company lot. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, unit 1214. The key turned smooth in the lock, like it had been used 100 times before, because it had. The door opened onto a life I never knew my husband was living. It wasn't a rental furnished by some corporate relocation package. It was a home, built carefully, over time. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on the kitchen counter, still tight in bud, no more than 2 days old. 2 coffee mugs dried on a rack by the sink, one his, an old university mug I'd bought him our senior year, one hers, unfamiliar, painted with a small gold vine around the rim. His cologne hung faint in the air, the kind he only ever wore for special occasions with me, anniversaries and Daniel's wedding, and the night he made partner-level equity in the company, or so I had always believed. Photographs sat framed on the mantel, Weston and Sienna on a beach at sunset, Weston and Sienna at a candle-lit table I recognized, with a sick lurch as Lucia's. In every single photograph, his wedding ring was gone from his hand. In the bedroom, his shoes sat lined up beside hers along the closet wall, arranged with the kind of easy familiarity that comes from months, not weeks. On the dresser sat a manila folder. 4 words were typed across the tab in a plain black label maker font. Future plans. My hands were shaking hard enough now that it took me 2 tries to open it. Real estate listings filled the first several pages. 3 different towns outside Denver circled in the same blue pen, notes in the margins about school districts and proximity to someone's parents' house in Golden. Underneath those sat something worse. Consultation notes from 3 separate divorce attorneys, dated 18 months back. The same 18 months I'd later realize lined up almost exactly with the vendor renewal I'd notarized without reading. A strategy, laid out in Weston's own handwriting across a legal pad. Frame it as irreconcilable differences. Document her lack of ambition since stepping back from operations. Cite emotional distance, established over time, well before any personal relationships began. He had been building a legal case against me while I made his dinner every single night. The last page of the folder had a date circled twice in red ink. File for divorce by January. Married to Sienna by Christmas. He had planned my ending down to the exact month, the way he planned everything, with spreadsheets and deadlines and contingencies. I sat down on the arm of a couch I'd never seen before, in an apartment my husband had built without me, and made myself keep reading, because some instinct told me the worst of it wasn't in that folder yet. It was in a slim trim green folder underneath it, one I almost missed. Bank statements, not personal ones, company ones, printed and highlighted in the same yellow marker Weston had used on our kitchen table for 2 decades. Vail Consulting Group, LLC, the vendor name from the renewal page I had notarized without reading, had been paid $2.3 million over the past 3 years in quarterly consulting fees. The registered address for Vail Consulting Group, LLC, printed plainly at the top of every invoice, was Sienna's own condominium, a different building 4 blocks from this one. My notarized signature sat at the bottom of 11 separate renewal authorizations, each one dated within days of a quarterly payment leaving the company. I hadn't just been lied to. I had been used, unknowingly, as the paper trail that made $2.3 million of fraud look legitimate to a board of directors who trusted my seal because they trusted me. I photographed every page, the listings, the attorney notes, the circled date, the bank statements, my own signature staring back at me from documents I'd signed half distracted over cold dishwater. Then I sat very still on that unfamiliar couch, in the middle of a life my husband had spent 3 years quietly constructing, and I understood that whatever I did next couldn't just be about a marriage anymore. It had to be about the truth, in full, in front of the people who still believed in the man I used to believe in too. Weston came home that evening at his usual time, 7:15, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. He kissed my forehead like nothing in the world had changed, the way he had 1,000 evenings before this one. Long day, he said, loosening his tie at the kitchen counter. Back-to-back meetings. Then Sienna and I went through the Q3 projections until almost 6. How is Sienna? I asked, keeping my voice light, setting a plate down in front of him like I did every night. Great, he said, not even a flicker crossing his face. Best VP I've ever worked with, honestly. We're in sync on pretty much everything these days. In sync. I stood in my own kitchen, the folder's contents photographed and backed up in 3 separate places by then, and asked if he wanted his dinner reheated. He thanked me. He told me, the way he had for 28 years, that I was the best. I smiled and reheated his plate and wondered, watching the microwave count down, how a man could lie this smoothly after decades of practice, and whether I had simply never noticed before, or whether the practice itself was new. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside him in the dark, running through everyone I could think to call. A lawyer felt too slow and too likely to tip him off through some discovery process before I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. My sister would tell me to burn the house down, which felt satisfying and useless in equal measure. Daniel and Paige weren't ready for this. Not yet. Not until I had something solid enough to hand them, instead of just my suspicion. There was exactly one person I knew who could do more damage to Weston Marsh in a single phone call than any divorce attorney could do in a year, because he sat above Weston on the one org chart Weston had never fully controlled. Gerald Whitmore had chaired Ridgeline's board since we incorporated it as a real company back in 2004, back when it was still small enough that board meant Gerald, Weston, and a family friend who did our taxes. Gerald was 71 now, sharp in a way that had nothing to do with volume, the kind of man who let silence do most of his negotiating for him. He'd known me since before Daniel was born. He'd stood up at our 10th anniversary party and given a toast about watching the real architects of this company build something out of nothing at a kitchen table. He noticed everything. He said very little. In 20 years, I had never once heard him raise his voice, and I had watched 3 separate executives leave the company within a month of drawing his quiet, sustained attention. I called him the following afternoon, once I knew Weston was locked into a 2 o'clock investor call that would keep him occupied for at least 90 minutes. My hands were steady by then. I'd had a full day to turn shock into something closer to resolve. Gerald, it's Elena, I said, Weston's wife. Elena. Something shifted in his voice immediately. Some old fondness giving way to caution, the way it does when a person senses a conversation is about to become something other than pleasant. Is everything all right? No, I said. I need to show you something about the company. About Weston. You're not going to like it. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. Long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Gerald finally spoke again, his voice had gone quiet and careful in a way I'd never heard from him before. Not even the year a supplier tried to sue us into the ground. Elena, he said slowly, before you tell me what you found, I need to ask you something first. And I need you to think very carefully before you answer it. In the last 18 months, has Weston asked you to sign or notarize anything for the company that you didn't read all the way through? I felt the floor tilt slightly under me, standing in my own kitchen with the phone pressed hard against my ear. How did you know that? Because I've had an auditor quietly looking at Vail Consulting Group for the last 6 weeks, Gerald said, and your signature is on every single renewal, Elena. I was trying to figure out how to tell you that without destroying you. I didn't expect you to already be standing in the wreckage. He exhaled, long and heavy, the sound of a careful man about to say something he'd rather not. And I have to tell you, what you found in that apartment isn't even the part that's going to end him. There's something else, something bigger than the money, and bigger than Sienna Vail. I think it's time you and I sat down in person, because Weston isn't just planning to leave you, Elena. He's planning to leave the entire company behind too, and take the best parts of it with him when he goes. I didn't answer him right away. I stood at my kitchen counter, in the same spot where I'd reheated Weston's dinner the night before, in the same spot where I'd signed 100 papers over the years without a second thought, and I tried to make sense of a sentence that had just rearranged changed everything I thought I understood about the last 24 hours. I had walked into this call believing the worst thing I would learn was that my husband had a girlfriend and a second apartment. Gerald had just told me, in his careful, measured way, that the affair might be the smallest piece of what was coming. Take the best parts of it where, I finally managed. Where is there for him to go? Not on the phone, Gerald said. I don't trust this line, and I don't trust what he'll do if he suspects either of us is looking closely right now. Can you come to my house tonight? 9 o'clock, after Weston's usually asleep by then, isn't he? I told him yes, he usually was. The same reliable 9:30 he'd kept for 28 years. The schedule I'd built my own evenings around without ever questioning it. Good, Gerald said. Bring whatever you found. Everything. And Elena, bring it on a drive, not your phone, and don't sync it to any cloud account with his name anywhere near it. I mean that. The seriousness in his voice frightened me more than anything I'd found in that 12th floor apartment. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing something I'd never once done in 28 years of marriage. I went through Weston's home office again, methodically this time, not looking for evidence of an affair, but looking for anything that might explain what the best parts of the company could possibly mean to a man already planning to leave it behind for another woman by Christmas. I found a second laptop, an older one, shoved into the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, under a stack of expired warranty paperwork, the kind of place you hide something you don't expect anyone to go looking for. It wasn't password protected. I don't think Weston ever imagined I'd get this far. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd first sketched Ridgeline Dynamics on a napkin 28 years ago, the same table where I'd notarized the documents that funded Sienna Vale's shell company without reading them. The desktop was nearly empty except for one folder, unlabeled, buried inside a generic system directory a casual snooper would never think to open. Inside it sat a dozen files with dates going back almost 2 years, business plans, cap tables, a pitch deck with a name across the title slide I didn't recognize. My cursor hovered over the largest file for a long moment before I clicked it open, my chest tight, some part of me already understanding that whatever was inside was going to be worse than anything I'd found in that apartment on Spear Boulevard. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The pitch deck was titled Meridian Aerostructures, and the first slide listed 2 founders, Weston Marsh, Sienna Vale. Underneath their names sat a subtitle that made my stomach drop clean through the kitchen floor. Precision Components for Next Generation Aerospace. Leveraging 15 years of established prime relationships. Established prime relationships. Ridgeline's prime relationships. The 3 defense contractors we'd spent nearly 2 decades building trust with. The contracts that made up 60% of our revenue, listed in a competitor's pitch deck as an asset already secured. I clicked further. There were emails, forwarded quietly to a personal account, containing pricing sheets and engineering specifications that belonged to Ridgeline and to no one else. There was a financial projection showing Meridian Aerostructures opening its doors with $11 million in committed capital, $2.3 million of it listed under a line labeled simply Founder Contribution, WM, the exact figure, to the dollar, that had quietly disappeared out of Ridgeline through Vale Consulting Group over 3 years. He hadn't just been funding an affair. He'd been using our own company's money, laundered through a fake consulting contract with my unwitting signature on it, to seed capital for a competing business he planned to launch the moment his divorce and his resignation both went through. There was a timeline slide near the back of the deck. Divorce finalized, resignation submitted. Meridian Aerostructures launches publicly, poaching key accounts within the first 90 days. Every date on that timeline lined up almost to the week, with the dates circled in red ink in the folder I'd found the day before. He had built 2 entire plans running in parallel for over a year. One to leave me, one to gut the company my father's retirement savings had built, and both of them were set to detonate within months of each other. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I closed the laptop. I thought about my father, gone 8 years now, handing over almost everything he had on a handshake, because he believed in the young man his daughter had married. I thought about the 11 employees who'd been with Ridgeline since the Aurora warehouse days, people who still sent us Christmas cards, whose mortgages depended on contracts Weston was quietly planning to walk out the door with. I thought about Daniel and Paige, who still believed their father hung the moon, and what it was going to do to them to learn otherwise. Then I copied everything onto a drive, exactly the way Gerald had asked, and I drove to his house that night with the truth sitting in my lap the entire way, heavier than anything I had ever carried in 28 years of marriage. Gerald met me at his front door before I'd even finished parking, like he'd been watching for headlights. His wife, Carol, made tea neither of us touched. I laid the drive on his kitchen table and watched a man I'd known for 20 years go quiet and pale by the time he reached the 3rd file. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. Gerald had built his career reading balance sheets for a living, and everything I'd found simply confirmed in ugly, specific detail the shape of something his auditor had already started tracing through Vale Consulting Group 6 weeks earlier. I need the full board on this by morning, he finally said, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Not Weston, not yet. The other 4, and outside counsel, and the forensic auditor I've already got quietly working the Vale Consulting angle. 9 a.m. before Weston even gets his coffee. He looked at me directly then, the way he had at our 10th anniversary party, except there was nothing celebratory in it now. Elena, I need you there. Not in the hallway. In the room. You're the the one with a notary seal on the documents that make this fraud look legitimate on paper. If anyone questions the paper trail, you're the only one who can speak to exactly how he obtained your signature and why. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay in the guest room because I couldn't make myself lie beside him one more time, and I rehearsed over and over the version of myself I needed to be by 9 o'clock the next morning. Not the wife who apologized for smelling perfume on his collar. Not the woman who let a comment about chest pains talk her out of asking hard questions. Someone steadier than that. Someone who had spent 28 years learning exactly how this company worked from the inside out, because I had built half of it with my own hands at a kitchen table long before Sienna Vale ever walked through its doors. Weston had no idea anything was wrong when he walked into the 10th floor conference room the next morning. I watched it register on his face in stages. First confusion, seeing the full board assembled an hour before their usual meeting, then something colder, seeing me seated at the far end of the table beside Gerald and a woman he didn't recognize, who turned out to be the forensic auditor. Then real fear. The first genuine fear I'd seen on my husband's face in 28 years of marriage. When Gerald slid a single printed page across the table and said, without preamble, "Walk us through Vale Consulting Group, Weston. Take your time." He tried at first to do what he'd always done. "This is absurd," he said, laughing in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Vale Consulting is a legitimate vendor. Elena signed off on every renewal herself. You can check the notary seal." He looked at me when he said it, clearly expecting me to back him the way I'd backed him at 100 investor dinners for over a decade. "I signed what you told me to sign," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than it had any right to after almost no sleep. "You handed me 11 pages while I was doing dishes and told me legal had already cleared it. You've been doing that to me for 28 years, Weston, and I let you, because I trusted you completely. I don't anymore. And I have the pitch deck for Meridian Aerostructures on a drive sitting in front of Gerald right now, with your name and Sienna's name on the founding slide, and our engineering specs listed as an asset you already consider yours." The room went very still. I watched Weston's face do something I'd never seen it do before in nearly 3 decades. Watched the practiced, easy confidence drain out of it in real time, in front of the 4 board members who'd trusted him with $200 million of company value, in front of the auditor whose 6 weeks of quiet work he'd apparently never suspected. He looked for one unguarded second like a much younger man, one who'd overreached so far past what he could actually control that there was no smooth story left to tell. "Elena," he started, voice dropping into the softer register he used when he needed something from me, the register that had talked me out of doubting him a dozen times over the last 3 years. "Let's discuss this at home. This doesn't need to happen in front of everyone." "It does, actually," I said, "because you didn't just lie to me at home, Weston. You used my signature to steal $2.3 million from a company my father mortgaged his retirement to help you start. You were going to walk out the door with our clients and our engineers' work and leave everyone who ever trusted you holding nothing. I'm not protecting you from this room anymore. I spent 28 years protecting you from every hard question anyone ever asked, including myself. I'm done." Sienna Vale, it turned out, had been sitting quietly through most of this in a chair near the door, called in by Gerald under the pretense of reviewing quarterly operations numbers. I watched her face change as the pitch deck came up on the screen at the front of the room, watched her realize in real time that the timeline Weston had built listed his divorce finalizing and his resignation submitting well before any formal announcement of Meridian Aerostructures, which meant functionally that if the fraud unraveled before he successfully extracted himself, she would be sitting exactly where she was now, in a room full of board members and an auditor, with her name on every single Vale Consulting invoice and nowhere left to stand. "I want counsel present before I say anything else," she said quietly, and it was the last thing I ever personally heard her say, though it was far from the last consequence either of them faced. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken venture investor named Robert Ido, who'd sat across from Weston at dozens of dinners over the years and always seemed a little in awe of him, finally spoke up from the far end of the table, his voice tight with something between disbelief and anger. "Weston, I put my own reputation behind this board's confidence in you 3 separate times when other investors got nervous," he said. "I told them you were the most disciplined operator I'd ever backed. I need you to explain to me right now how disciplined operating includes forging a paper trail through your own wife's notary seal." Weston didn't answer him. I watched my husband, a man who had never in 28 years failed to produce a smooth explanation for anything, sit in a conference room full of people who had trusted him with their money and their reputations, and simply have nothing left to say. It was the quietest I had ever seen a room full of powerful people become, and some part of me understood, sitting there, that whatever else happened next, this particular version of Weston Marsh, the one who always had an answer, was already finished. The board suspended Weston as CEO before lunch that same day, pending a full forensic investigation, with Gerald stepping in as interim chief executive, a role he'd sworn for years he never wanted at 71 years old. Outside counsel filed a civil suit within the month to recover the $2.3 million diverted through Vale Consulting Group, and the forensic auditor's findings went to federal prosecutors not long after. Once wire transfers crossing state lines turned what had looked like an internal matter into something with real criminal exposure, Weston hired the best defense attorney his remaining money could buy. It wasn't enough money to buy his way fully out of what the documents showed. Sienna Vale, it turned out, was the first unexpected ally I gained in all of this. Though ally isn't a word either of us would have chosen for it at the time. Facing her own exposure on the Vail Consulting invoices, and realizing through her own attorney that Weston's finalized timeline had her covering nearly all the legal risk while he walked away with the new company's clean slate, she agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors within 3 weeks. Her testimony corroborated every piece of the paper trail I'd handed to Gerald that first night, and added detail I never had. Recorded conversations where Weston discussed, in his own voice, exactly how he intended to structure the shell company to keep my notarized signature as the primary liability shield if anything ever went wrong. He'd planned from the very beginning for me to be the one left holding the fraud if it ever surfaced. Sienna gave that plan to prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. I never spoke to her directly. I didn't need to. Her cooperation did more to protect me legally than anything I could have said on my own behalf. My sister Renata flew in from Phoenix within 2 days of that board meeting, before I'd even told her the full extent of it over the phone. Just showed up at my door with a suitcase and a look on her face that said she wasn't leaving until she was sure I could stand on my own 2 feet again. She'd never fully trusted Weston, not the way I had, something she admitted to me for the first time that week, sitting at my kitchen counter at 2 in the morning while neither of us could sleep. I always thought he loved being admired more than he loved being known, she said. I never said it because you seemed happy and it wasn't my marriage to have opinions about. I asked her why she was telling me now, after 28 years of keeping that particular observation to herself. Because you don't need me to be right anymore, she said. You already know. I just needed you to know I saw it too, so you don't spend the next 10 years wondering if you were the only one who missed it. She stayed 11 days. She cooked more meals in that time than I had energy to cook for myself, and she never once, in 11 days, told me what I should be feeling, which turned out to be exactly the kind of company I needed most. Daniel drove up from Fort Collins the day the story became public inside the company, before it ever reached the local business press. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd notarized documents I never should have signed, and he didn't ask me a single question about whether I'd known. He simply said, "Mom, what do you need?" and started making calls to help me find a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving significant business assets. He'd always been steady like that, even as a boy, and I found myself grateful in a way I hadn't expected for the particular kind of son who shows up with a legal pad instead of a lecture. Paige took it harder, at least at first. She was closer to her father in some ways, had spent a summer interning at Ridgeline before law school, and had always seen him the way I once had, as a man who'd built something out of nothing through sheer will. She called me twice in the first week, accusing me, gently but unmistakably, of blowing up the family by going to the board instead of handling things privately. It took her almost a month, and a long, difficult conversation where I finally showed her, in full, the timeline slide from the Meridian Aerostructures deck, the one where her father's divorce finalizing and her own inheritance disappearing, lined up on a single page like line items in a spreadsheet before she understood that I hadn't blown up anything. He had built the explosive himself over 3 years, and simply hadn't planned for anyone to find the wiring before it detonated on his own schedule instead of mine. Weston made 2 more moves in those first difficult weeks that told me everything about who he'd become, or perhaps who he'd always been underneath the version of himself I'd spent 28 years believing in. He tried first to reach Daniel and Paige directly, separately, before either of them had fully processed what was happening, framing the entire situation to each of them as their mother overreacting to a business disagreement and some paperwork misunderstandings. Daniel hung up on him. Paige, to her credit, told him plainly that she'd seen the timeline slide herself and didn't appreciate being lied to twice by the same parent. When that failed, he tried reaching me, late one night, voice soft and pleading in the register he'd used on me for years, telling me that if I just backed off the civil suit, told the board I'd misunderstood, we could still salvage something of our life together, that Sienna had manipulated him, that none of it would have happened if I hadn't pulled away emotionally after Paige left for college. I let him finish. Then I told him, calmly, that I'd already heard that particular story from him before, the one where whatever he'd done was somehow a reasonable response to something I'd failed to give him, and I no longer had any interest in editing my own memory to make his choices make more sense. I hung up. He didn't call again. There were quieter costs too, the kind that don't show up in a civil complaint or a board resolution. Our joint accounts were frozen for 11 weeks while the forensic accounting sorted out which of our remaining funds were legitimately marital assets and which were tangled up in the fraud, which meant I spent almost 3 months living carefully off a small inheritance from my mother, watching legal fees accumulate on both sides faster than either of us could really afford. I sat for 6 hours with a forensic accountant going through every joint statement from the last 5 years, watching, line by line, the slow bleed I'd never noticed happening in real time. I found myself, more than once, grieving not the man Weston had become, but the version of him I still remembered clearly from a backyard wedding in 1998, the one who'd promised my father he'd pay back every dollar with interest and meant it completely. That man had existed. I had loved him honestly for a very long time. Somewhere in the last 3 years, or perhaps much longer than that, he had quietly stopped being the man I married, and I had kept setting a place for him at the table anyway, because I hadn't known yet that he was gone. I found an old photograph one evening that autumn, packed away in a box I was sorting for the divorce, of Weston Weston at 26, grease-stained and grinning outside the first warehouse in Aurora, my father's arm slung over his shoulder, both of them looking at something just out of frame like it was the best joke either of them had ever heard. I sat on the floor of my closet for a long time, holding that photograph. I let myself cry finally, not for the marriage that had ended in a boardroom, but for the two young men in that picture, one of them dead 8 years now and never knowing how his handshake loan would eventually be used, the other one somewhere on the other side of town preparing for a deposition, having become someone his younger self, grinning in that photograph, would probably not have recognized at all. I almost threw the photograph away that night. I sat with it in my lap for nearly an hour, deciding. In the end, I kept it, tucked into the back of a drawer rather than a frame on any wall, because some part of me understood that erasing it wouldn't erase the 28 years it represented, and pretending those years hadn't mattered felt like its own kind of dishonesty. One more lie added to a pile that already had enough of them. My father believed in that young man in the photograph for good reason at the time. I had too. Believing in someone who later becomes unworthy of it doesn't retroactively make the belief foolish. It just means the story didn't end where either of us expected it to. Gerald held a town hall for all 210 Ridgeline employees the week after the board suspended Weston, and he asked me to stand up front with him, not to speak, just to be visible. A familiar face people had trusted at holiday parties for years, standing steady beside the news that was about to upend their sense of the company's leadership. I watched grown men who'd worked the machining floor since the Aurora days, men who'd taught Daniel to run a lathe one bring your kid to work day years earlier, sit with their arms crossed and their faces unreadable while Gerald explained, in careful, plain language, what had happened and what the company was doing to make it right. Afterward, a woman named Rosa, who'd run quality control for 11 years, found me by the coffee station and said quietly, "We always knew you were the one who actually cared about this place." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, entirely. It felt like the kindest and saddest thing anyone said to me that whole year. Ridgeline Dynamics survived the scandal, though not without real damage. 2 of the 3 major prime contracts required extensive reassurance meetings before agreeing to stay, and one smaller client left entirely, citing governance concerns, a euphemism I understood better than most people reading that press release ever could. Gerald asked me, 3 months into his interim role, whether I'd consider taking a formal seat on the board myself, given that I understood the company's history, its finances, and its culture better than almost anyone left standing after the dust settled. I said yes. Not because I needed the money, though the divorce settlement, once finalized, was smaller than it should have been given 28 years of marriage, thanks to legal fees on both sides eating into everything. I said yes because some stubborn part of me still believed in the company itself, separate now, finally, from any belief in the man who'd started it. The wider fallout took its own strange shape over the months that followed. Word moved fast through Denver's business circles, faster than any of us could control, and I learned quickly which of the friendships built over 28 years of dinner parties and charity galas had ever really been mine, and which had only ever been Weston's, borrowed by me for the duration of the marriage. 2 couples we'd vacationed with for over a decade simply stopped calling, the kind of quiet erasure that stings more than an argument would have, but others surprised me. Weston's own sister, Diane, called me the week the story broke in the Denver Business Journal and said, without preamble, "I've watched him do smaller versions of this his whole life, Elena. I should have warned you 30 years ago." Carol Whitmore started showing up on Tuesday afternoons with a thermos of coffee and no particular agenda beyond sitting with me while I sorted through boxes, and somewhere in those quiet Tuesdays, she stopped being Gerald's wife to me and started being simply my friend. A woman named Patrice, who'd worked the front desk at Ridgeline since the Aurora days and remembered me bringing Daniel in as an infant in a carrier, while I dropped off invoices, sent a card that said only, "We all knew who really built this place," and I kept it taped inside a kitchen cabinet for a long time afterward, taking it out on the harder days. The criminal case moved slower than any of the personal fallout, the way these things do. Federal prosecutors indicted Weston on wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty just after the new year, with Sienna's cooperation forming a significant part of the government's case alongside the paper trail Gerald's auditor had already assembled. Weston's attorney fought hard for over a year, delaying, filing motions, trying every angle a very expensive legal team could try, but the evidence was too specific, too well documented, too thoroughly cross-referenced against my own notarized signature and a competitor's pitch deck bearing his name in his own handwriting. He took a plea deal eventually rather than risk trial, admitting to wire fraud in exchange for prosecutors dropping several of the more serious charges. He was sentenced to 31 months in a federal facility outside Englewood, along with restitution orders that ate through most of what remained of his personal assets after the civil suit had already taken its share. Sienna, whose cooperation had been extensive and early, received probation and a smaller restitution order of her own. I felt, when the sentence came down, considerably less satisfaction than I'd expected to feel after 2 years of hearings and depositions. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sad, in a way that surprised me. The divorce itself finalized 8 months after that first day at the gate, faster than it might have otherwise gone, because Weston's attorney understood by then that fighting me on the settlement terms would only invite more scrutiny into assets already under federal restitution orders. I kept the house in Cherry Creek, the one we'd bought in 2000 2009 once the company finally started turning real profit. And I sold it 11 months later anyway. Not because I needed the money, but because I couldn't walk past the kitchen table without seeing 11 pages of paperwork I'd signed without reading, or a photograph of two young men outside a warehouse in Aurora, grinning at something just out of frame. I bought a smaller place near Wash Park instead, close enough for Daniel to visit on weekends, close enough to the reservoir that I could walk it most mornings, which I started doing not for my health exactly, though it helped that too, but because it gave my mind somewhere to go besides depositions and restitution schedules, and the particular ache of realizing slowly that grief doesn't always arrive on schedule with the news that caused it. I started seeing a therapist that first winter, something I'd never done in 28 years of marriage, mostly because Carol suggested it gently over one of those Tuesday coffee thermoses, and I finally ran out of reasons to say no. It helped more than I expected, not because anyone could explain away what had happened, but because I needed badly to say out loud to someone who wasn't a lawyer or an auditor or my own grown children that I had loved a man for 28 years who had apparently been capable of this the entire time, or had become capable of it slowly enough that I never saw the shift happen, and that both of those possibilities felt equally unbearable in their own way. My therapist asked me once, gently, whether I blamed myself for not noticing sooner. I told her the truth. Some days I did. Most days, increasingly, I understood that a marriage built on 28 years of honest effort on my end doesn't deserve to be measured against a betrayal built just as carefully, just as patiently, on someone else's. I went to the sentencing hearing, though my attorney told me I didn't have to. Daniel sat on one side of me, Paige on the other. The first time the three of us had been in a room together with Weston since the whole thing came apart, he looked smaller than I remembered him, in a gray suit that no longer fit quite right. The confidence that had carried him through 30 years of boardrooms noticeably absent from the way he stood when the judge addressed him. When he was given the chance to speak, he apologized, mostly to the company, to the board, to the employees whose jobs he'd put at risk. He mentioned me once briefly, saying he regretted the pain this caused my family, a sentence so carefully generic it could have applied to almost any wrongdoing at all. I watched Paige's jaw tighten beside me. She'd hoped, I think, for something more specific, some acknowledgement of the particular ways he'd used me, my signature, my trust, my father's memory, as tools in a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with getting away clean. He never quite got there. Some men, I've come to understand, run out of honesty exactly at the point where honesty would cost them the most. Sienna wasn't in the courtroom that day. I heard secondhand, through someone who still worked at Ridgeline, that she'd moved to Chicago after her own sentencing, taken a much smaller role at a firm with no ties to aerospace, and mostly disappeared from the world Weston and I had built together. I never developed strong feelings about her in the end, one way or another. She'd made her own choices, inside a situation Weston had constructed with the same careful patience he applied to everything, and she'd paid a price for those choices, smaller than his, but real. I understood by then that my anger had never really been about her. It had always been about him, and about the 28 years I'd spent believing his version of things over the evidence sitting quietly in front of me the whole time, if I'd only ever thought to look. I've thought a great deal, in the 2 years since that afternoon at the gate, about what actually kept me from seeing it sooner. It wasn't stupidity. People love to imagine that betrayal on this scale requires a kind of willful blindness that surely I must have known, on some level, and simply chosen comfort over confrontation. I don't think that's what happened to me. I think instead that 28 years of a man consistently keeping his word trains a person to extend trust automatically, the way a muscle you use every day for decades stops requiring conscious effort. Weston had spent nearly 3 decades building exactly that kind of trust with me, brick by brick, promise kept after promise kept, before he spent the last 3 years quietly cashing it in. The settlement, once everything finally cleared 18 months of legal proceedings, came to just under $600,000 after fees, a fraction of what 28 years of marriage and a $200 million company should have entitled me to, but restitution orders and a federal fraud case have a way of eating a fortune faster than any divorce court can protect what's left of it. I used part of it to buy the place near Wash Park outright, no mortgage, the first home I've ever owned free and clear in my own name alone. I used another part of it to start something small of my own, a consulting practice helping family-run manufacturing companies set up the kind of internal financial controls Ridgeline never had in its early years, the kind that might have caught Vail Consulting Group in its first quarter instead of its third year. 3 clients so far. Nothing that will ever rival what Ridgeline became, and I've stopped needing it to. I earned my own paycheck for the first time in over 2 decades this past spring, small as it was, and it meant more to me than any number on any statement Weston ever showed me. My life now looks smaller than it used to in some ways, and considerably larger in others. I sit on Ridgeline's board, still alongside Gerald, who finally handed the interim CEO title to a genuinely qualified outsider last spring, and returned to simply chairing meetings, the role he always preferred. I walk the reservoir most mornings, rain or not, because I've found I think more clearly with my body moving than sitting still. Daniel got married last fall, in a small ceremony I helped plan without ever once thinking about seating charts designed to keep 2 feuding sides of a family apart, because there was only one side left by then, and it was mine. Paige finished law school in in the spring and told me over dinner not long ago that she's specializing in corporate fraud. A choice she made, she said plainly, because of everything she watched me go through. I didn't know whether to feel proud of that or sorry for it. I've settled mostly on both. I still think sometimes about that security guard at the gate, the one who laughed and pointed behind me and told me he saw Weston's real wife walk out every single day. He wasn't wrong, exactly, though I don't think either of us understood the sentence the same way in that moment. I'd spent 28 years being the wife who built the foundation, who signed the papers, who sat at his right hand at every dinner that mattered, and somewhere along the way, without my noticing exactly when it happened, I'd stopped being someone he had to perform honesty for. Sienna got the performance. I got the truth, eventually, the hard way, in a folder on a dresser and a laptop hidden under expired warranty paperwork, and it turned out the truth was worth considerably more than 28 years of a comfortable, well-maintained lie. There's a version of the story where I end it triumphant, where I tell you I never think about him anymore, where the ending arrives clean and satisfying and closes like a door. That isn't quite honest, and I promised myself somewhere around the second year of depositions that I was done building any part of my life around a story that wasn't fully true. I do think about him. I think about the 26-year-old in that photograph outside the Aurora warehouse, grinning at my father like the two of them had just gotten away with something wonderful, and I let myself miss that version of him sometimes, the one who kept his word to a machinist who'd handed over his retirement on a handshake, the one I actually married. That man is gone now, or maybe he was never entirely real to begin with, just a role Weston played convincingly enough that even he believed it for a while. Either way, I lost something the day I found that folder that I never fully get back, some particular ordinary faith in the man I woke up next to for 28 years. I've built a good life on the other side of that loss. I don't pretend it cost me nothing to get here. Some mornings, walking the reservoir before the rest of the city wakes up, I think about how close I came to never opening that laptop at all. It would have been easier, in the short term, to let the smell of unfamiliar perfume stay unmentioned, to let a security guard's mistake pass as exactly that, a mistake, and drive home to reheat a plate of chicken piccata for a man who was already halfway out the door of the life I thought we shared. I understand now why so many people choose that version. Comfort is a powerful argument, even when it's built on sand. But I think about my father, handing over his retirement on a handshake because he believed a promise meant something. And I think I owed it to him, and eventually to myself, to find out whether it still did. It didn't. Not from Weston. It still does. From Daniel, from Paige, from a handful of people who showed up with coffee and casseroles and no particular agenda except staying. That, in the end, is the whole of what I learned standing at that gate with a bag of takeout going cold in my hands. The people who are quietly, consistently there, without needing an audience for it, were the real family all along. It just took losing the performance to finally see who they were.